Welcome to Inside Voices, a well-read magazine, Between the Pages podcast. I'm Robert Gwaltney, joined by my host and dear friend Jeffrey Dale Lofton, and we're both so excited to enter into conversation today with Shastri Akella. Welcome, Shastri.
Thank you for having me.
So, Shastri, before we begin, I want to share a little bit about you with our listeners. Shastri Akella's debut novel, The Sea Elephants, was published by Flatiron Books in the USA and Canada and by Penguin in India. He was a writing resident at the Fine Arts Works Center and the Oak Springs Garden Foundation. He's winner of the 2022 FracturedLit Flash Fiction Contest and the 2023 Best Microfiction Contest. His writing has appeared in Guernica, Fairy Tale Review, Craft, The Master's Review, Electric Literature, World Literature Review, The Rumpus, and elsewhere. Most recently, his story, The Magic Bangle, was included in the Best American Short Stories 2024, which was edited by Lauren Groff. He earned an MFA in creative writing and PhD in comparative literature at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's currently an assistant professor of creative writing at Michigan State University. Jeffrey?
Shastri, it's always a great opportunity to talk with you. I just enjoy your company so much. And your book, I simply loved it. And I'm always interested in book covers and titles and as the author's way into the story. And you have a couple of covers of your book. There's one for North America and one for India. But my favorite is that red, blue, and white mask. So I wonder why sea elephants? What significance of them? How do they show up in the cover and the story?
Yeah, Jeffrey, first I want to say likewise, I love being in conversation with you. It's only been a week and I already miss our conversations. Um, so this cover, the main character, it comes from the story, which is what I like about it. The main character is a street performer and he uh, joins a street theater troupe that performs stories from Hindu mythology, often stories that have been censored through translation. So, if you go back to the epics in the original language, Sanskrit or Pali, you'll find these stories, but over time, no one or very few people could read the source material. And translations that were made available in Hindi and regional languages and English censored out a lot of these stories. And this street theater troupe in the novel performs those stories because a lot of them come from underprivileged castes and Dalit castes. And so they feel a sense of empathy for these censored characters. And one of those characters is that of Chitrangada, who is a trans character from the Mahabharata, which is the longest epic poem in the world and one of the most important texts in Hinduism. In the original version of the Mahabharata, Chitrangada has three full chapters, and she shows up at multiple points in the story. But in translated version, she's been cut down to two paragraphs. And all of the work that she's done, a lot of the heroic work that she's done, has been distributed across the male members of this novel or of the Mahabharata. So it's not only she's not only been axed out, the text itself has been altered to make room for her absence. So this cover is the mask of Chitrangada. It's the mask that the main character Shagun wears when he performs the role of Chitrangada, and it's an important moment in the novel because, without giving too much away, it's the first time when he performs the role of Chitrangada, he becomes comfortable with his own gender fluid identity, which he has a complicated relationship with up until that point, which of course has everything to do with the fact that he grew up in a very homophobic environment and is on the run and joins the street theater troupe because there's uh, right-wing homophobic Hindu forces that are after him, set after him by his own dad in the novel. So yeah, so it represents a transformative moment, but also an important character in the story. The sea elephants is the central motif that is there throughout the novel. It's the one myth that the character performs multiple times, and each time he performs his story, something about himself and his reality shifts a little bit. Um, either he gets accepted into a street theater troupe or he meets his significant other. So there's key narrative moments are somehow connected with the story of the sea elephants, and it's also the story that he used to perform with his siblings. This is not a spoiler because it's literally the first sentence of the novel. He loses his siblings. They drown and die, and he feels responsible for their death. But before they die, he would perform these stories with them, just in a very childish play acting kind of way. So it's one of those stories that crosses the borders of his personal and his professional life as a performer. And its repetition, its motif-like quality made it the perfect title. Actually, my editor picked the title, Carolyn Bleak. She picked the title for the novel. My agent and I were struggling as to what we should name it, and I somehow wanted the word elephants in the title. And when I spoke to Carolyn, she said, "Yeah, what about the sea elephants?" And I said, "It's the most obvious thing, but we never reached for it." But she did.
Why did you want elephants in the title?
I mean, I just love them. They were very predominant around the area I grew up in. Actually, the hills in southern India, which are the Nilgiris, they don't get as much love as the Himalayas do, but they're also very beautiful hills. They were the hills of my childhood where I'd go hiking as a teenager and as a child with my parents. Um, there's one particular area in the Nilgiris which has globally the highest overlap of human and elephant populations. That concentration of the overlap is the highest. So people have found a way to live in harmony with the elephants, even when they sometimes turn violent, which they do at a certain age. So there is that by default, like sort of a love for elephants as an animal, which I've felt as well. I've felt like a sense of they have a sense of mythic presence to me as well because they are both in the wild and then in civic spaces like in these towns in the Nilgiris, um, and of course the connection with Ganesha as well. So I feel like they cross all these borders of the divine and the animal, the human and the non-human. So they're very special to me.
In that culture, do people own elephants, or do they just exist? I know that some are in the wild and some are not, but how do they interact? How does that happen? How does that work?
I mean, Kerala, which is in southern India, there are families where elephants are owned, and they have these are massive homes, obviously, which with big courtyards where an elephant can reside, and they're fed really well. Um, 2 times a week, I think there's like somebody comes in, the mahout comes in, takes the elephants for to bathe in the river. That's not too far. So they lead a pretty good life for the most part. The Nilgiris, it's much more they're in the wild, and sometimes when elephants turn a little feral, which they do, like I said, at a certain age when they enter puberty, they're trained, so that's the only time there's a human intervention, just to make sure they don't come in and trample huts and um, they don't come and destroy food sources. So because they can, there are all these banana plants, which plantations where the elephants can come and just go wreak havoc. So at that age, if that starts to happen, there are people who are trained to go make sure that they're subdued and don't come in too much into the human space.
Hmm, fascinating.
Shastri, I'm so taken by the very different worlds your protagonist navigates. Home, magpies, the boarding school, the street theater culture, being locked away, and even the small world of the cauldron in which he escapes on his own. All of these are unfamiliar to me and probably most who grew up in North America. How did you create these places in a way that captivates someone like me who isn't familiar or has that frame of reference?
I'm glad you said that and that the fact that they did captivate you because I may have shared the story with you, Jeffrey. When I first started sending this novel out, an agent who read the book said, American readers are not interested in stories set in South Asia. You should go try and sell this somewhere else. And um, I'm just very heartened with the experiences I've had with readers like yourself, with readers I met last week and at the James River Writers Festival. I read sections of the book that are set in spaces that are very particular to the time and place of the novel, and readers had no problem connecting with the text. Um, I think if you make a sweeping statement about all American readers, it's most likely not going to be true. I think readers are a lot more nuanced than the industry sometimes gives them credit for. And to my luck now, the agent and editor I have really understood the novel for what it is. They didn't want me to domesticate it for an American audience. They didn't ask me to italicize any of the words or say, oh, this is too foreign, just remove it. They accepted the novel for what it was. And I wanted the spaces to be there because it is being told from a first person point of view. You are traveling with Shagun through all of these spaces. And I wanted readers to get a lived version of those spaces, the way Shagun's experiencing them firsthand. Um, I think at a textual level, narrative level, something that really benefited me was he's discovering a lot of these places for the first time himself. So he enters this cauldron that's located right behind his boarding school. So he wants to know what it is. And so as he goes about trying to figure out what the cauldron is and discovers what it is, readers discover it alongside him. So he finds out that this boarding school, once upon a time, was a place where British officers would rest because it's in the hills. And so that cauldron was used to make food for a lot of people who would stay in the boarding house, British officers. So he finds that out and he gets that information himself and then passes it on by proxy to readers. When he joins the street theater troupe, um, he's a new member, so he has to be trained. So he learns the language and the culture and the values of street theater as it happens in this particular part of India and this time. Because there are multiple versions of street theater as well, and this is one version of it. And he experiences that and learns about it. So readers learn with him. So I think it helped that he was a newcomer to all of these spaces. So him learning about them allowed readers to learn about them. Um, but I was thinking each experience when I was revising the book, not so much when I was doing an early draft, what is the core emotional resonance in each of these spaces? And those core emotional resonances everyone experiences, right? I mean, in the cauldron, he's gone to sort of embrace the isolation that he's been subjected to in the boarding school. And we've all experienced isolation. We've all had moments where we've felt like outsiders. It might be in an office space, it might be at school, it might be somewhere else, but we felt like outsiders. And I think my goal with revising those scenes was to make sure that emotion comes to the surface because that becomes the anchor that readers can hold on to and sort of enter that space. Because in my own experiences, readers, when I've read, as a reader, when I've read stories set in Eastern Europe or set in the US parts, which I was not familiar with, what allowed me to carry through the unfamiliarity was the emotional resonance. And in some cases, I didn't 100% understand the setting, and that was okay with me as a reader because I knew the character knew it and I had an emotional connection with the character. So I think those were the two things, um, allowing readers to learn about the space by the main character learning about them and creating an emotional anchor that is universal in many ways. That allowed me to bring it to an American readership.
And you were
Shastri,
very successful.
Thank you.
in Shastri, Shagun does encounter such hardship along the way, and losing his siblings, being on the run, having to sort of find a new world to exist in a couple of times. And I do agree. I know exactly what you mean. There's a universe. We have universal experiences, universal feelings. Everybody can understand certain fundamental ways of being. And I heard you say in an interview at one point, if you don't matter, none of your troubles matter. And I think that is another sort of universal thought. But I would love to hear more about why you said it, this observation, what and how it relates to your story.
That happened. That was from an essay I'd written for LitHub, which was drawn from a very personal experience where uh, so I did not come out till I actually started writing this novel. So I came out in an MFA program because a professor who read the pages said this is dying to be a gay love story. So I took therapy and came out on the last day of her workshop. But when I was living in India and working at Google, I was facing a lot of pressure to have an arranged marriage. And I was not interested because I thought I was asexual. I just wasn't attracted to women in the kind of spaces I grew up in. being attracted to men was not an option. So I just assumed I was asexual. And I did not want to have an arranged marriage because that would not be fair to me or to the girl I would get married to. So I sort of left my hometown of Hyderabad and moved to Delhi, still with Google, but had like a lateral transfer. And it was alienating because my family was there and I couldn't be around them, and I was in a new place, and I would still keep routinely getting called to see girls, uh, prospective brides. So I was so fed up. Every weekend I would go to hiking in the Himalayas. The Himalayas are not far at all from Delhi, with an overnight train or sometimes even shorter. You can just go to a whole new hike. So I was hiking through the mountains every weekend, and that was my refuge. The hills became my refuge, which is why mountains even now have a very special place in my heart. And so when I would go into the Himalayas, just being surrounded by such majesty, just by the scale of these mountains, it just made me feel small, not in a bad way at all. I just thought of these mountains. They were not only, the stature was much bigger than me, they were also so ancient. They existed well before I did and will continue to exist well after I'm gone. And there was just such quiet majesty to them that I just would sometimes go to go to a peak and just sit there and be almost like this trance-like meditation would just overcome me, and I would just, it was comforting. It was a form of therapy in nature. um, and it was also a way for me to think that, oh, I, in the long run, I don't matter, and so therefore if I don't matter, my problems are insignificant. And maybe it was a way to sort of escape the problem, but in the moment it was tremendously helpful. And I think the reason at that point I wanted to escape the problem was I did not know the source. I did not realize that I'm gay and I'm not asexual. And once I found that out, I found the strength, and also in the US and Amherst, the community to support me through that process. Um, but I was also thinking of, in God of Small Things, Arundhati Roy's novel, there's this beautiful moment where this character is talking to his young nephew and niece about the age of the earth, and he says if the earth woman is, say, 42 years old, um, all of human civilization from the time humans showed up to what we know of them today, it's nothing more than the glint that has just started to appear in the eyes of the earth woman who's 42 years old. So which shows like all of human race is just so tiny compared to the experience of the earth. Um, and I think sometimes it can be humbling in the best possible way. So I think in terms of how I brought that into the book, it does show up because Shagun is on the run. He's not yet found his significant other, not for 6 years after he leaves and runs away from home. So street theater becomes his source of escape, because he is able to become all these other characters and live these other realities. One of the things his theater chief tells him is myth is always told in the present tense. So he has to, when he's performing those characters, he becomes them. And in becoming them, is able to suddenly gain access to this full spectrum of emotions of each character he performs. He performs gods and demons, men, women, and trans characters, uh, young, old, children, animals in some cases. So he suddenly, from being so emotionally stunted, where he's bullied at school for being who he is, rejected at home for being who he is, suddenly he's living this very emotionally rich life that's made available to him through art, through performance. Um, so suddenly, and he's on the run, he's safe. So his problem that he's ignoring for now doesn't matter to him anymore, because he has the full spectrum of emotional experience in his theater troupe.
Mm.
Shastri, I love that that your writing is actually what set you out on your journey to come out into the world. I think that's, I mean, what a lovely story that your art helped you find yourself in many ways.
Absolutely. I know. I mean, if I wasn't a writer, I just don't know. I shudder to think where I would have been.
Well, you talked about your education. You have an MFA in creative writing. You have a PhD in comparative literature. Yeah, and you mentioned Google, and your stint as a street theater performer. How would you say, digging down a little deeper into that has shaped your writing?
The street theater in very direct ways, because once I knew, so when I was hiking in the hills in India, in the Himalayas, that's when one of the days I had this very distinct image come to me of a young man who's transferring pictures from one wall to another wall. One is the wall of the living and the other is the wall of the dead. So he's just transferred a picture to the wall of the dead, and then he puts on his backpack and closes the door of his house and leaves. I have no idea where that image came to me, but it wouldn't leave. So I started journaling from that young man's perspective, and he became Shagun, the main character of this novel. Um, and I wanted to figure out what he would do when he leaves home. So during one of those travels, I saw a street theater troupe perform, and I just knew instinctively that he joins the street theater troupe. And I actually shadowed that troupe, not that year, but the following year. So they travel along the Ganges from the point she merges with the ocean to her point of origin. And I traveled with them for 2.5 months. Um, so much that I observed with the way they use makeup as really a ritualistic space to turn to literally be reborn as the character. They think of their green rooms as both the death chamber and the place where the midwife brings. So the makeup man is seen as the midwife who brings his character to life. Um, and the fact that myth is always told and present in so many little details of how they go about putting their performances up, I would not have known without actually working with them. And the first time I saw them perform, the fact that their theater performances are not on the stage, the actors are not these very elevated artists who become, mythic figures. In fact, they perform very close to their audience. Their props are very, very basic. Oftentimes, I and these street theater actors, we'd sleep with the villages that we perform. They would just let us sleep in their backyards out in the open. So our lives were very enmeshed with that of the audience. There was no separation, and I love that. um, so I think that in a very direct way not only informed this book, but also I think it's going to shape my second novel too, just in terms of living your reality in a very authentic way. I think that will be very much a part of the second book. With Google, I mean, I both my siblings work in tech. A lot of people from South India who come to the US work in tech. It's just seen as a way to make money. And I did not know what I wanted to do in life when I started my undergrad. So just based on the guidance of my siblings and my parents, I just went and did an undergraduate in computer science, joined Google, started programming for them, did not like it one bit, but they moved me to their advertising team, which was a little better. But in terms of, I think, transference of skills, I would say that two things that will shape my writing, have shaped my writing in the past. One is, I think, just structure. It's really allowed me to look at structure in ways that I would not have inherited if I didn't work for a company like Google. At a very micro level, for instance, if I have a sentence that I'm not happy with the sound of, because for me, text is very sonic and oral, it has to sound the right way. Um, Otherwise, I cannot move on to the next sentence, especially in later drafts. So if a particular sentence is just not sounding right, I pull the sentence out, put it in a new doc, a blank Word doc, and have every word in its own line. So that way each word is sort of surrounded by this white space. And that makes it easier for me to eventually come up with the right sound for that sentence. That kind of logic of extracting a sentence and putting it in its own Word doc, that kind of editing technique, some way structurally, I've inherited it from how Google runs its operations and focusing on both micro and larger macro goals. Um, and it's also given me a sense of discipline to make sure I write every day, because when I was at Google, I had to wake up every morning and write because those were the only times that were mine. Sometimes you would just end up work would just take over and you'd end up having to stay at work till 10:30. So then there's no way you'd have the energy once that's done to come back home and write. So the mornings are your own. Nobody can claim those hours. So just making sure that I wake up every morning and write, even if it was for 20 minutes, even if it was for an hour, it didn't matter. Just that discipline stayed with me. So now there are times of the day when I just know I have to write. So I'll just stop everything I'm doing and just write. So I think it's more than specific stories, it's informed the way I approach writing as a process.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm an early morning writer as well, um and I know that we sometimes do that out of necessity, but there's something, don't you think, rather magical about those early hours, fresh from sleep before the world has begun, that I don't know, that's just conducive to storytelling.
Yeah, I think it's just like our mind is blank too. It's like we've rested and we don't have the whole day sort of percolating through our mind. So it's much more clean. I usually before I sleep, I look at what I want to write for the next day, sort of I look at what I've written that day and then my plan for the next day and let that sort of work through my subconscious. So when I wake up, I'm ready to write.
Yeah, your creative fuel tank is full in the morning, and I guess you deplete it during the day. That's a great time. I prefer to write in the early morning as well. Um, Shastri, you mentioned you mentioned the street theater troupe again and Google, and I was thinking when you mentioned that they're both kind of families, and there's our work family, whether we
Mm.
like them or not. There's a family element to that, and then of course um, the street theater. That's certainly there's a connection there that you don't get in the corporate world. And and I've heard you talk about family in a different way. You've described it as the idea of vertical and horizontal family. And I'm
Mm.
curious to know how that shows up in the sea elephants.
I mean, that structure of the vertical and horizontal family I found in Andrew Solomon's collection of essays called Far from the Tree. It's a really beautiful, powerful collection. Highly recommended if you haven't read it. So it's a collection of essays. Each essay is quite literally about the apple that's fallen far from the tree. So Andrew Solomon is himself a gay man, so what it means to be a gay man born to a straight couple. There's a chapter on prodigies, there's a chapter on someone who's alternately abled, um, somebody who's neurodivergent. So it's just how, when a child's experience varies significantly from that of their caregivers, how it shifts this vertical identity, because vertical identities, biological identities, are built on this understanding that a child will be exactly how their parents are. Um, and Andrew Solomon talks about even the word reproduction, the act of creating children. We use the word reproduction as if the child will be a replica of the parent. Um, and that for a long time, even in terms of profession, that lineage was kept alive, right? Like a farmer's child oftentimes becomes a farmer. The child of a king ends up inheriting the throne. Um, but when you move away from that kind of a vertical identity, when you are the apple that's fallen far from a tree, you have to go out into the world and make your own family. That's your only way to thrive. Um, so interestingly enough, at Google, I made one I mean, I would say, a couple of really good friends. But one of them, she is my found family, and she's the only one who shows up directly in the novel. So the character of Sue in the novel is based on her. And even now, when I go to India, I go and spend at least 3 weeks with her and her partner. I truly think of her home as my home in India. Um, so I think for me, finding these people, and then they were not always queer. Like Sue is straight and she's a woman. So they were not always gay men, but they were people who were able to see me for who I am. I felt visible in their presence, and without being afforded that visibility, especially after I came out and was alienated from my own biological family, I don't think I would have been here today, and the book would certainly not have been here today. A lot of these pages were written in the homes of my found family. So in Sue's home, in Sabina Marie, the professor whose workshop I came out and went on to become one of my closest friends. So I stayed at her home, and there was a summer when I couldn't travel to India because it was not safe to do so, and I had to just stay in the summer, and graduate students don't get paid in the summer. And she said, just that's fine, just come stay with me. So it was just that summer she sort of adopted me into her place. So I think because found family was such an important part in me finding my own sense of self, I wanted Shagun to experience that. And I also wanted readers to be able to see that there is real power in building this kind of community of your own. And found family, the sort of horizontal identity, also shifts away from the pyramid structures. The pyramid structure places your partner at the top of the pyramid. Your parents come next, your siblings come below that, your extended family, then comes your friends and then your colleagues, which is not a very healthy cycle, especially when you put so much on your partner. It's not fair to yourself or to your partner. Um, Found families often work in this sort of circular economy where your friend is as important as your partner, who's as important as your non-human friends, who's as important as your parents. So it's just everyone is equally important. There is no hierarchy there. And I think it's a much more healthy way of living where you don't need one person to be the one refuge for everything you experience, which is also not realistic. We are, like, Edward Said talks about how each of us are multitudes, and it's impossible for one person to satisfy the multitudes we contain, which is why this kind of a circular economy is a much more psychologically healthy way of living and thriving. So in the novel, uh, the street theater, especially one of the street performers, becomes part of Shagun's found family. He befriends the friends of his boyfriend, and they become part of his found family. So Sue is actually his boyfriend's friend, but they become very close friends, and they go hang out and do things on their own, which does not involve the boyfriend at all. It's just moments that they have as friends. There is a moment in the novel where the boyfriend Mark wants Shagun to hang out with him, but he's made plans with Sue. He's like, I'm going to do that instead. So there is this no idea of, because the plan was already made. I did not want to reach for that impulse where he cancels that plan to privilege his boyfriend instead. And the boyfriend is completely understanding of it because he knows the friendship that they share is special. So I think friendship, especially for queer men, especially for those who live their lives in non-normative ways, friendships become very, very powerful. I think it's Foucault who wrote that essay, Friendship as a Way of Life, which was, especially for gay men in the 80s, was such a foundational text because they were abandoned by their families, and it's their friends who came up and showed up for them. So, um, sorry, it was a very long-winded answer to that question because it's a topic that's very close to my heart.
No, it was perfect. Thank you. And Shastra, we are coming to the end of our time together. It's flown by. But before we part ways, talk a little bit about what's next for you. I'd love to hear what you're working on.
I just finished a draft this summer of my second novel, very rough draft, but it's found its essential shape, which I'm happy about. Um, it's a story that's set in the future. It is fantasy, and I'm gonna claim the genre. Um, it's it's literally fantasy written in the legacy of Ursula K. Le Guin, whose work I love. It's set in this future where America's white population has become the minority, and to um, fix that problem, the conservative regime at the time decides to offer political asylum to vampires as long as they count themselves as Caucasian when they come to the US. So it's the first pilot batch of vampires have come in to Ellis Island, and they're injected with a serum that removes their hunting instinct. So they don't go around killing human beings, and there are blood markets that open up for them to buy blood. So it follows this queer Irish vampire who lands in the US, and follows his journey navigating through New York. There are people who want him there, the people who don't want him there, and he has to call himself Caucasian when he enters the US. And I don't think I'd ever write a novel that does not have a gay love story in it, or found family in it. Of course, he finds his family in the US, which is a mixture of humans and vampires, and falls in love with this Kashmiri doctor who's created the serum that removes the hunting instinct. So they eventually meet, and it for me it was so much about this. Writing this novel was about questioning um, how we look at immigrants, because not every immigrant has the same experience, right? And some immigrants are seen as more welcome than others. If you look at the immigration system itself, um, depending on which country you are from, say if you're from England, your green card process can be done within 2 years. If you're from Mexico, it can take 125 years. I'm not even making those numbers up. So our relationship with immigration is complex. And I say this as somebody who loves this country. I found tremendous refuge and community in this country. So, like Ilhan Omar says, when I critique a system in this country, it comes from that space of love and not any sense of dislike for the country itself. But I also wanted to do it through allegory, through fiction, rather than being very explicit about it. So I said, I'm going to have fun with this and say it's vampires who are migrating to the US. I also love vampires. So,
I do too, and I love that the vampires are going through Ellis Island, and I love that they have to declare themselves Caucasian. That's brilliant. If you needed an advanced reader for this book, sign me up.
oh, thank you. I might actually take you up on that.
Absolutely. So, Shastri, it's been lovely speaking with you this evening. We wish you every success.
Thank you.
Congratulations on your success with your debut novel. Um, so anytime you want to come back, we're going to sign you up when that second book makes its way out into the world.
Okay, that would be wonderful. I really enjoyed talking to both of you. Thank you for such thoughtful questions in the conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, gentle listeners, until next time, for Inside Voices, I'm Robert Gwaltney.
And I'm Jeffrey Dale Lofton. And remember, to be creative is to be courageous. Thanks for joining us.
I love that line, to be creative is to be courageous.
It's true.